Ever wondered what could get a woman in big trouble in the Middle Ages? Would you believe simply laughing too loud could mark you as sinful? Number 7. Vanity, the mirror's deadly reflection. Did you know medieval women were told their mirrors were portals for the devil? It's true. Women who spent too much time gazing at their reflections were considered deeply sinful in medieval times. Church officials and moralists warned that vanity was not just a character flaw, but a dangerous path straight to damnation. When a medieval woman picked up her polished metal mirror, glass mirrors were rare and expensive luxuries. She wasn't just checking if her wimple was straight. According to religious authorities, she was potentially committing a grave sin. Texts from the period frequently compared women's mirrors to the devil's tools, suggesting that Satan himself might appear in the reflection to tempt vain women. One popular medieval sermon claimed, "The devil holds the mirror for women to admire themselves, and with each admiring glance, he claims another piece of their soul." Pretty extreme for just checking your appearance, right? Cosmetics faced similar condemnation. Any woman applying makeup was accused of trying to correct God's work, a blasphemous act. The red dyes women used for their lips and cheeks were particularly suspicious to medieval moralists, who compared them to the flames of hell. One 13th century text dramatically stated, "With each application of rouge, a woman paints her own path to eternal fire." Even nobles weren't exempt from these warnings. Queen Isabella of France, 1295 to 1358, was criticized in contemporary accounts for her love of beautiful clothes and accessories, with one chronicler noting she owned 419 gowns, considered excessive even for royalty. These criticisms later fueled her portrayal as vain and morally corrupt after her role in deposing her husband Edward II. What's fascinating is how these attitudes shaped women's behavior. Many wealthier women navigated this tricky terrain by presenting their beautiful clothing as signs of their husband's status, rather than personal vanity. Meanwhile, religious women turned rejection of vanity into a virtue. Saints like Clare of Assisi were celebrated for cutting their hair and abandoning fine clothes as signs of devotion. The most ironic part: while condemning vanity, medieval culture simultaneously pressured women to be attractive. A woman's appearance was closely tied to her marriage prospects and social standing. This impossible standard, look beautiful but don't try to look beautiful, created a no-win situation that echoes through the centuries into modern beauty standards. Number 6. Gossip. When words could brand you a witch. Did they really cut out women's tongues for talking too much? Not quite. But the penalties for female gossip could be shockingly severe. Medieval authorities viewed women's speech, particularly gossip, as dangerous and potentially subversive. The sign of the tongue ranked high among female vices in medieval moral literature, with gossip portrayed as a uniquely feminine evil. Women who talked too much were called jangleresses or clatterers, terms loaded with moral judgment. The famous scold's bridle, or branks, a metal cage fitted over a woman's head with a piece that pressed down on her tongue, stands as physical evidence of how seriously this sin was taken. Used primarily from the 16th century onward, it built on medieval attitudes that women's unrestrained speech required physical control. Women forced to wear this contraption would be led through town, experiencing both pain and public humiliation. Church officials warned that gossiping women were doing the devil's work, spreading discord and destroying reputations. The 14th century Book of Vices and Virtues dramatically claimed, "The tongue of a gossiping woman works faster than the devil's own hands at unraveling community bonds." Out, perhaps most dangerously. A reputation for gossip could lead to accusations of witchcraft. Many witch trials began with local gossip turned against women who themselves gossiped too much. Court records from witch trials often cite suspicious speech or muttering as evidence of diabolical tendency. The connection made sense in medieval minds. If words had power, as in prayers and blessings, then women's uncontrolled words could have dangerous power. Historian Karen Jones notes, in an era where speech was believed to have tangible effects on the physical world, uncontrolled female speech represented a frightening loss of social order. This fear extended to all women, but particularly targeted widows and older women living alone who lacked male supervision of their speech. When midwife Agnes Sampson was accused of witchcraft in Scotland in 1591, witnesses testified she talked endlessly and spread stories. Her gossip became evidence of her supernatural crimes. Social historian Laura Going discovered court records showing women developed creative responses to these restrictions. Some strategically used gossip networks to protect themselves, sharing information about dangerous men or unfair employers. Others carefully framed their speech as reporting rather than gossiping when bringing concerns to authorities. The ultimate irony: while condemning female gossip, medieval society relied heavily on women's communication networks for everything from spreading news to maintaining community standards. The very gossip condemned from the pulpit helped enforce the moral codes the church promoted. Number 5. Disobedience. When wives were expected to bend the knee, would you believe a medieval husband could legally beat his wife for talking back? The sad truth is that female obedience wasn't just preferred. It was mandated by law and religion. Disobedience ranked among the gravest female sins in medieval thinking. The ideal woman, according to countless texts from the period, was submissive first to God and then to her male relatives, especially her husband. This hierarchy wasn't merely suggested. It was encoded in religious doctrine, legal systems, and social practices across Europe. The good wife keeps silence when her husband speaks, advised the popular 15th century text, How the Good Wife Taught Her Daughter. This wasn't just domestic advice. It reflected core medieval beliefs about gender roles rooted in biblical interpretations, particularly St. Paul's instruction that wives should submit to their husbands in everything. The consequences for disobedience could be severe. Most medieval legal codes permitted husbands to moderately correct their wives through physical punishment. While extreme violence was technically prohibited, the reality often proved harsh. Court records from 14th century London include cases where men were cleared of charges after beating disobedient wives, with one judge noting, "A man may chastise his wife, but not maim her." Even women of noble birth weren't exempt from these expectations. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was imprisoned for 16 years by her husband King Henry II for supporting their son's rebellion. Her disobedience cost her her freedom, despite her royal status. Religious institutions reinforced these power structures. Marjorie Cambe, whose autobiography provides rare insight into a medieval woman's life, recorded being denounced from the pulpit and interrogated for heresy largely because she traveled without her husband's permission and spoke publicly about her religious visions. Her disobedience to gender norms made her suspicious to church authorities. Women's resistance took subtle forms. Historical records show some claiming spiritual equality through religious devotion while outwardly conforming to obedience. Others negotiated space for autonomy through careful management of household authority. Court records reveal women who defended themselves against abusive husbands by arguing the punishment exceeded moderate correction, successfully using the system's own logic against it. Perhaps most telling is how disobedient women were pathologized. Medical texts from the period described female disobedience as a form of illness potentially caused by wandering womb or excess heat in female bodies. This medicalization of normal human assertiveness shows just how deeply entrenched the expectation of female submission was. The legacy of this sin echoed well beyond the Middle Ages, influencing gender dynamics for centuries to come and creating resistance patterns still recognizable today. Number 4. Laziness. When idle hands were more than the devil's workshop, can you imagine being considered morally corrupt for taking a break? For medieval women, laziness wasn't just frowned upon, it was considered a gateway to all other sins. Medieval authorities viewed female idleness as particularly dangerous, believing that unoccupied women would inevitably fall into sin. "Never let thy hands be idle, for the devil dances in empty palms," warned one 14th century household manual aimed at women. This wasn't casual advice. It reflected deep-seated fears about female morality. The daily routine of a medieval woman was relentlessly demanding, varying by social class, but never easy. Peasant women worked the fields alongside men while also maintaining households, preparing food, brewing ale, spinning, weaving, childcare, and tending animals. Urban tradeswomen and merchants' wives managed businesses while handling domestic duties. Even noble women supervised large household staffs, managed estates during husbands' absences, and produced textiles. Any break from this constant labor could raise suspicions. Church sermons frequently connected female leisure with moral danger, suggesting idle women would gossip, engage in lustful thoughts, or neglect religious duties. One popular medieval text, the Book for a Simple and Devout Woman, stated bluntly, "Idleness in a woman leads first to loose talk, then to loose behavior." The spinning wheel symbolized proper female industry so completely that the term spinster eventually came to denote unmarried women expected to be constantly spinning to contribute to household economies. Archaeological evidence confirms this cultural emphasis, with spindle whorls among the most common artifacts found in excavations of women's living areas across all social classes. Time management became a moral issue for women in ways men rarely experienced. While men's leisure activities like tavern games or hunting were generally accepted, women's moments of rest fell under scrutiny. Medical texts even suggested that female idleness created physical illness, claiming underused female bodies accumulated dangerous humors that caused melancholy and hysteria. The pressure extended to religious women as well. Nuns followed strict schedules, alternating prayer with productive work. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, despite her mystical visions and writings, emphasized that her nuns should always keep busy with practical tasks between prayers. Records show women developed creative responses to these pressures. Some redefined necessary rest as preparation for better service, while others incorporated brief prayers into work routines to demonstrate spiritual diligence alongside physical labor. Court records occasionally reveal women defending themselves against accusations of laziness by meticulously accounting for their time, evidence of how seriously such charges were taken. The most poignant aspect of this sin was its impossibility. Medieval women's work was literally never done, yet they were still frequently criticized for insufficient industry. The psychological toll of this impossible standard rarely appears in official records, but occasional glimpses emerge in women's writings and court testimonies showing the anxiety it produced. How exhausting would it be to live in a world where even necessary rest was considered morally suspect? Number 3. Lust, when female desire was the ultimate danger. Did medieval people really believe women were more lustful than men? The surprising answer is yes, and this belief created centuries of dangerous double standards. Female sexuality was viewed with profound suspicion throughout the Middle Ages. Despite the period's reputation for sexual repression, medieval authorities weren't concerned about sex itself. They were specifically worried about female sexual desire, which they considered naturally excessive and potentially destructive. Medical texts from the period described women as insatiable in their carnal appetites. The influential 13th century philosopher Thomas Aquinas wrote that women's greater moisture and receptiveness made them more prone to sexual excess than men. This wasn't just philosophical speculation, it shaped real policies regarding women's behavior. The double standard was stark. While male promiscuity might receive mild criticism, female sexual activity outside marriage could result in severe penalties, including public humiliation, exile from communities, or even death in extreme cases. Court records from medieval cities show women prosecuted for adultery at rates far exceeding men, even when the behavior was identical. Even within marriage, female desire raised concerns. Church penitentials, handbooks for confessors, listed specific penances for wives who demonstrated too much enthusiasm for marital relations. One 13th century text warned that a wife who provokes her husband to lust should fast for 3 days, while making no similar recommendation for husbands. This anxiety about female sexuality extended to appearance. Clothing regulations throughout Europe specifically targeted women's dress, with particular concern about any styles that might provoke lust in male observers. Interestingly, this placed the responsibility for men's desires squarely on women's shoulders, creating the medieval version of "she was asking for it." The ultimate expression of this fear was the witch hunts that intensified in the later medieval period. The infamous witch hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, explicitly connected female sexuality with witchcraft, claiming all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable. Many accused witches were charged with sexual crimes like seducing men or engaging in intercourse with demons. Despite these restrictions, evidence suggests medieval women maintained their own sexual identities. Court records reveal women who defended their right to sexual pleasure in marriage. The popular Romance of the Rose depicts women speaking frankly about desire, suggesting awareness of female sexuality existed alongside attempts to control it. Perhaps most telling are the medical practices of the period. While condemning female lust as dangerous, medical texts simultaneously prescribe treatments for uterine fury, excessive female desire, that sometimes included masturbation or marital sex. Tacit acknowledgement that female sexuality was natural, even while framing it as problematic. This contradictory approach to female desire created impossible standards that echoed through centuries of gender relations, affecting everything from courtship rituals to marriage expectations to divorce proceedings. Number 2. Pride. When self-confidence became a deadly sin. Would you believe a medieval woman could be condemned for walking too confidently? Pride was considered not just inappropriate for women. It was seen as a fundamental rejection of their proper, humble role. Pride ranked among the 7 deadly sins for everyone in medieval theology, but took on special significance for women. While male pride might be redirected into appropriate channels like military prowess or intellectual achievement, female pride was considered fundamentally inappropriate, a rejection of the humility deemed essential to womanhood. A woman should keep her eyes downcast and her voice low, instructed the popular 15th century conduct manual, the Book of the Knight of the Tower, reflecting the widespread belief that female modesty should be visible in every aspect of behavior. This wasn't merely aesthetic preference, it was considered moral imperative. Physical manifestations of pride received particular attention. Women who walked with excessive confidence, spoke too loudly, or laughed too heartily faced criticism as prideful. Marjorie Kempe's autobiography recounts being condemned for her loud weeping during religious experiences, her emotional expressiveness interpreted as inappropriate pride rather than devotion. Intellectual pride proved especially dangerous. Women who demonstrated learning beyond their station faced severe criticism. When Christine de Pizan, one of medieval Europe's few professional female authors, first published her works defending women's intellectual capabilities, she was accused of unnatural pride for presuming to enter scholarly debates. This condemnation extended to religious expression. While male mystics like Bernard of Clairvaux were celebrated for direct communion with God, female mystics faced intense scrutiny to ensure their visions didn't reflect prideful presumption. Julian of Norwich carefully framed her revelations as coming to me a simple creature, emphasizing her humility despite the profundity of her theological insights. The consequences for perceived female pride could be severe. Women labeled as proud might face social ostracism, reduced marriage prospects, or exclusion from guild activities. In religious communities, penalties could include public penance, reduced rations, or physical discipline. Court records from the period show women accused of proud behavior facing fines or public shaming punishments. Even noble and royal women weren't exempt. Queen Isabella of Bavaria, wife of Charles VI of France, was viciously criticized in contemporary chronicles for her excessive pride in ceremonies and dress, criticism that became central to later portrayals of her as morally corrupt. Her actual crime: maintaining dignity and royal bearing during her husband's mental illness. The most effective aspect of this sin was how it created self-policing among women. Letters and diaries from the period reveal women constantly monitoring themselves and each other for signs of pride, preemptively apologizing for any assertion of knowledge or authority. This internalization of pride as sinful created psychological barriers to female self-advocacy that would persist for centuries. Yet women found creative ways to navigate these restrictions. Religious women reframed their spiritual insights as gifts from God, rather than personal achievements. Female guild members emphasized collective rather than individual accomplishments. Writers like Christine de Pizan strategically presented their work as benefiting men, making their intellectual contributions more acceptable. The condemnation of female pride created a lasting template for criticizing women who step outside expected roles, patterns still recognizable today whenever confident women face accusations of arrogance for behaviors celebrated in men. Number 1. Curiosity. When knowing too much made you dangerous. Ever wondered why curiosity killed the cat became a popular saying? For medieval women, curiosity wasn't just discouraged, it was considered potentially deadly to their souls. Female curiosity ranked as perhaps the most insidious sin in medieval thinking about women. From Eve's fateful bite of forbidden fruit onward, women's desire for knowledge was portrayed as dangerous, disruptive, and fundamentally threatening to social order. A woman should not seek to know more than befits her station, warned one widely circulated 13th century text. This wasn't casual advice. It reflected deep anxiety about female intellectual pursuits. While male curiosity might be channeled into scholarly or scientific endeavors, female inquisitiveness was treated with profound suspicion. The consequences could be severe. Women who asked too many questions or demonstrated interest in prohibited knowledge, particularly related to theology, law, or natural philosophy, risked being labeled as disruptive or even heretical. Court records from the Inquisition show women facing scrutiny for possessing books, discussing theological matters, or simply asking too many questions during religious services. This fear of female curiosity extended to practical knowledge as well. While women commonly served as healers and midwives throughout the medieval period, those who demonstrated too much interest in understanding the underlying principles rather than just following traditional practices could face accusations. Many women prosecuted as witches were traditional healers, whose curiosity had led them beyond approved boundaries of female knowledge. The 15th century Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, explicitly connected female curiosity to susceptibility to diabolic influence, stating, "When a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil." This framing made intellectual curiosity itself evidence of potential moral corruption. The prohibition extended even to religious contexts. While men's religious education included theological reasoning, women's was generally limited to rote prayers and basic moral instruction. When mystic Mechilde of Magdeburg recorded her divine visions in the flowing light of the Godhead, she preemptively defended herself. "I cannot help this writing, for I must do it, and often I stand in great fear and must wait to find out whether these matters come from God." Despite these restrictions, evidence shows medieval women maintained intellectual curiosity. Archaeological findings include women's personal possessions with written texts suggesting private reading despite prohibitions. Court records occasionally reveal women defending their right to knowledge, like one 14th-century French woman who argued before church authorities that God gave minds to women as well as men. Libraries borrowing records show women accessing books through male relatives, while wills indicate women bequeathing books to daughters and nieces, creating underground networks for female learning. These small acts of resistance suggest women recognized the artificial nature of restrictions on their intellectual development. Perhaps most telling are the exceptional cases of educated medieval women whose writings survived: Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, who carefully framed their knowledge as divinely granted rather than personally sought. This suspicion of female curiosity created lasting educational disparities, with formal learning considered inappropriate for women well into the modern era. The legacy of treating female intellectual pursuits as potentially sinful echoes through centuries of restricted educational access for women worldwide. How different might history be if women's curiosity had been celebrated rather than condemned? What knowledge have we lost through centuries of silencing half of humanity's questions?